Hello, everyone. This is Colleen Milton, and on behalf of EchoStor and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled Digital Transformation, the Art of Aligning Technology and Business. Leading off the discussion today will be Stephen Hill, who is Senior Analyst, Applied Infrastructure, DevOps, and Storage Technologies at 451 Research. Following Stephen will be Vinny Lee, who is Chief Strategist in the Office of the CTO at EchoStor. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen below. We will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session, and we'll respond to all unanswered questions via email after the webcast concludes. This presentation and slides are available for download. And finally, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning to join us in this conversation. This is interesting, and I'd like you to introduce to Vinny, my cohort here. So, Vinny, say hi.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
And Vinny and I have been having some really excellent conversations about this evolution or the next generation of what IT is all about. And so the interesting point, and this is something that always comes up, is the challenge is how can you do something without a plan? Now, IT is typically required to deal with things on an ad hoc basis. Things come up, things change, but ultimately, if you have a long-term plan that provides you at least a roadmap for where you want to go with things, it's much easier to make adjustments in different directions based on some of the new things that pop up or adopting new technologies because you have a path you can follow. So first question is, look at this, building a business plan is the first issue is identifying your key business needs, because realistically, IT is about supporting business. The next challenge is software as an ecosystem, which is looking at the next generation of software that's designed to work together, to come up with common business solutions, to come up with data and resources that are useful for a broad variety of reasons, rather than dealing with each of your softwares as an independent. Obviously, we realize that they have to be dealt with especially, but ultimately the whole idea is having a broader idea, adopting a fluid infrastructure, and this is the next generation. We're going to go into detail on all four of these points as we go along through the show here. And the last one is future-proofing in terms of data management, because ultimately data is evolving. The way it's being used, the way it's being protected, and the way it's being secured are changing pretty dramatically. So first off, we're starting off with a question that we asked earlier this year about where do you think you are in this digital transformation process? Because if you look back, I mean, most of the time we're not talking about a digital transformation from a manual process or from a human process. We're really talking about evolving an earlier IT process into a much more dynamic and flexible process. And so when we asked, about a third of the companies said that they were actually doing this at this point. But it's interesting to note that the other two-thirds, or give or take, are really still only the evaluation process or just basically thinking about it, considering it, or they don't even have a strategy to do it. Now, that's all well and good, because ultimately we need to deal with the challenges as they come up, but ultimately having a broader idea of how to address these things over the long term is really a smarter way of doing it. So this is the first section, and my colleague Vinny and I are going to tag team on this. We've got a lot of points to cover, and ultimately, well, let's put it over to Vinny. Why don't you cover the first point, Vinny?
Yeah, this is great. You know, I spend a lot of my days, you know, working and engaging with customers on their journey and their evolution in this thing called digital. You know, I find that more often than not, you know, a lot of what Steve talks about in the prior slide with, you know, a third of folks are well on their way, but the majority of folks are not. Part of the reason why they're not is because they don't have a plan or a strategy in place. So, you know, my first, you know, goal is really to have a conversation with, you know, with folks that are embarking on this journey and asking them to articulate and identify, like, what exactly is your plan for digital? Not everyone has that that plan and strategy well in hand. So this first bullet that talks about, and some of these concepts seem so simple, but they're so important. But locating and engaging the right key stakeholders. As a selling person out there in the industry, I'm placed in front of, we'll call it my traditional customer or my traditional buying center. And when I ask the question of, hey, what is your digital strategy? More often than not, I get the, yeah, I'm not really sure what that is, but I think I know who might know. So, first and foremost, it's like go find the person who's got that, and make sure that you understand, what is important and what the objectives are of that digital strategy is to their business.
And the next point in prioritizing your mission and business critical apps is a difficult one. And I typically look at this from a disaster recovery business continuity perspective. But ultimately, you need, as a technologist, you need to have an idea of what's really critical for business to proceed, whether it's mission critical, which is globally across the business, or it's business critical, which are specific applications that are an absolute necessity for conducting business. You need to understand the relative weight that you need to put on these applications, and whether it's protecting them or it's making them more flexible. These are the things that you need to keep in mind as you build your plan.
Yeah, the third bullet, looking for potential synergies between departments. This starts to touch on the pervasive adoption of the strategy. You look for areas complementary in their skill sets, towards driving towards that and achieving that digital strategy. If let's say marketing folks want to run a digital marketing campaign, they presumably have the data. That's complementary to the data management and integration and data engineering required to run analytics on that data within core IT. So when you bring those worlds together and you find the strengths between those functional areas, it just helps to facilitate that transformation and the execution of that strategy so much better.
And the next step, and I think the biggest step, is considering dealing with the human factor. And this is really a complex problem because I think all IT problems are typically, human-based problems, whether it's errors or whether it's miscommunication. I mean, ultimately it comes down to the whole idea of wrapping your head around how an IT business or a process impacts the human aspect of it. Are they getting the right information? Because humans do really interesting stuff. I always say that they're my second favorite species next to dogs, because dogs are really cool. But ultimately, it comes down to the idea that this is always an inter-reaction between humans and technology. And our job as technologists is to simplify that and make sure that it's as seamless a process as possible. So you need to worry about the human factor in terms of, errors, mistakes, and things that are just perfectly human in nature, as well as the impact that technology will have on the people who need it. So this is where it gets complex, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and finally, the notion of making that, the articulation of that digital strategy and plan pervasive throughout the organization. It should be, once that strategy is well formed, it should be easy to communicate to everyone across the organization, because they really need to start to embody the objectives articulated in that strategy. And whether that manifests as a mission statement on the back of an ID card, or it's a slogan hanging on the wall, it's generally something that's outcome based, I would say, right? So folks have a clear vision of where this ship is headed once we embark on this journey.
Absolutely. And the next point is these are the top IT factors that we asked our customers, or I should say our respondents in our polling, what are the top factors for where you decide that workloads belong? And this is across all market sectors, because typically when we do, this is out of our vote, the Voice of the Enterprise polling that we do on a regular basis here at 451. And we constantly tap a brain trust of 70 to 80,000 IT professionals in specific vertical markets to be able to understand and keep a pulse of the way the IT industry is moving. So anyway, in this case, this is earlier this year, 600 respondents. Cost remains at the very top, and understandable. This is something that everybody's being pressured into, but very close behind are security, performance, and availability. So ultimately, if we're talking about the top 4 factors here, these are things that are consistently important. But we decided to break that out. And how does that focus? And this is a big chart, so we're not going to explain it all, but you'll have the opportunity to look at it at your convenience. As we broke it out based on vertical markets, you suddenly start noticing that the requirements and the priorities are different, as they should be. And what this does, it gives a general idea that suddenly says not everybody's worried completely about price. They might be worried about the security angle, or they might be worried about uptime, or they might be worried about where larger systems reside. But ultimately, you could draw a chart like this from even businesses within the same vertical market, because internally your departments may have different factors that are more important for them. And again, our job as technologists is to look at all of that. So this is not an exercise in frightening you with the different variables here. What it is, it's a matter of giving you an idea that even though things may seem an intelligent way to move in from your context, that it really pays to have feedback from either your specific business stakeholders or from even the users. And I think that this is something that's overlooked all too often, because it's easy to get into a development model that doesn't include users, but ultimately it's part of the challenge is being able to make that link between human process and computerized process.
Yeah, I would also add that these few slides are great examples of and the titles of them are these are top IT factors, right? They're in many organizations, departments kind of run against their own perceptions of priority and their own perceptions of agenda, right? So when those priorities and agendas are not tied back to a unified business plan or business strategy, this is where the differences start to manifest. So right. I think in as much as they highlight the fact that there are different care abouts of this within different departments, but if there's clear unilateral agreement on strategy, it's quite possible that some of these initiatives start to align better as time goes on and that company's evolution goes on.
Exactly. And this slide that we're looking at now is a top IT pain points. It's, again, an understanding that what's important for IT may be different than what's important or what's a problem for your users or your business units. So, these are really key. Information security, I've done tons of polling and looked at tons of polling, and security really almost always tops out in terms of the most important issue. And it's becoming more so because, again, security and privacy are becoming more and more important factors. But again, this is the challenge that we're looking at, because they want to do all these things, they want to be more flexible, but IT staffing is a huge issue for them. The ability to respond effectively is a challenge for them. Managing a legacy infrastructure is a huge drag. And this all happens all too often, where whether it's out of convenience or out of necessity, you have technology that's been around for a very long time, and it's no longer ideally suited for what it was originally intended, or what was expected of it has changed, or what the need has changed. So we're looking at, literally the evolution of IT right around us, and that's something that's easy to lose track of. So let's bring up the next step, which is software as an ecosystem. And it's a fancy $10 word, but really what it says is that you need to look at, and this is again my opinion, but you need to look at software as from a broader perspective, as a method for collecting and managing data that can be spread across multiple use cases, multiple departments for multiple purposes. So starting with the first point on that, this is where it comes down to identifying those first key synergies, whether you're collecting data for one thing and it might be useful for something else. This is where you're building out a new software environment that, instead of looking at that as two separate and disparate use cases, you need to look at them as how they work together. And Vinny?
Yeah. So so the next key characteristic here is scalability. I'll even go as far as saying that perhaps the characteristic should also include elasticity, right? Because so part of the value of leveraging the ecosystem within software is really to give you this flexibility around scale up, scale down, and being able to go broad and wide. The mechanisms are now in place, and technologies are available that allow you to do these things. It provides a lot of flexibility, a lot of elasticity, and to the degree that you can leverage those characteristics, for the betterment of your organization and your architecture. Those are great things to have as part of your business planning and digital plan.
And we're also looking at new needs I shouldn't say needs, but new choices, new opportunities, new models by which data can be used over the long run. Whether it's analytics or AI or whatever you decide to call it, ultimately we're finding that data has a long-term historical value. And ultimately the challenge becomes to look at how you could pull all of this information that you're getting from all of your different business units and use it as a tool that can take on a life of its own, really, because some of these things you can only learn over time. And the interesting thing about looking into deeper learning or into analytics of your data is that you never know what you're going to find. I mean, it's nice to have, nice to think of IT in terms of business intelligence as being something that you go into it knowing exactly what you want. And ultimately, analytics processes are about, whether they're about finding the needle in the haystack or understanding trends that you don't see, it's always an evolutionary process where you're still learning what you need to know to learn what you need to know. And this is something that's an evolutionary process all the time. And this is where the challenge is in making sure that you're dealing with data as it is now and data as it could potentially be used upstream. And that requires a little creativity and a little thought.
Yeah. So this notion of digitization is, so Steve and I have these interesting conversations around the opportunity around digitization, and I think for us, this we view this endeavor of digitization as a watershed moment to go back into your business and fix processes that may have been effective up until a certain point in time. Or may not have been effective at all. I'm out here at a conference this week, and I was talking to one of our distribution partners about their evolution in their supply chain digitization. Right, so they took a very, I'll call it, Amazonian approach to re-architecting supply chain for themselves, and they went directly at the outcome. Like, here is the end customer experience that I'm trying to garner, and started working from that point on backwards to drive requirements back into the system that they're leveraging, or the platform that they're leveraging for supply chain, as opposed to leading with the platform and then trying to shoehorn a customer end user experience goal back into the platform. So that was a classic example of, you're trying to make it better for your end customer, but you start with that clear objective right up front.
Yeah, and that some of these long-term objectives may shift over time, but how can you get to some place like that if you don't have a map or a plan for it? And ultimately, we've had to deal with things on an ad hoc basis forever, because that's what IT is about, really. It's about adopting new technologies, dealing with things in a new way, and ultimately, it still pays to have a vision of where this should lead in the end. And this is one thing I push on, because I'll also cover this area, is business continuity and disaster recovery. And this is an evolving process because, face it, that used to be just backup. I mean, really, you just had to back things up, and that was the only way that you could protect yourself. Now we're talking about an environment, especially in a hybrid environment, where it becomes more about availability. And even though data protection still remains job one, it's also about, well, how are these going to be, how can you ensure availability? How can you make sure that the dependencies of a complex process remain in place so that process stays alive if things change? Ultimately, this is something that we're seeing as a growing importance across the industry, the ability to be able to protect workloads and ensure workload availability as opposed to just simply trying to protect data. And believe me, not every business continuity problem is a disaster, but some of them are. And so ultimately it comes down to the challenge of being keeping this mindful when you're building out a new strategy that says, look, we've got this new process, we're building this beautiful integrated environment, but if this process X goes away, how does it affect the rest of that ecosystem? And it's challenging. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. So so Steve, so you and I have had conversations about this, before as well. It's funny, like the terminology that we use, business continuance and disaster recovery. One could argue that business continuance is, in past parlances, was somewhat tied to technology, right? And business continuance in today's world very much could be tied to things like compliance, right? So you and I, Steve, have talked about GDPR, right? Man, like if you get hit with a breach and you're subject to GDPR, that's kind of a showstopper, and that has very little to do with technology directly, but man, so I think you're spot on. It's like being mindful of those things, but being mindful of those elements outside the purviews of traditional IT is becoming more prevalent in these circles.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at the environment that is now, especially as you go more hybrid, ultimately we try to provide a certain amount of resilience in our systems, but ultimately SLAs are more of a guideline. I mean, ultimately, whether you're building out an internal SLA or whether you're depending on an external company's SLA, ultimately they do the best they can, but things happen. So realistically, you need to look at this from a standpoint of it's like the Pirate's Handbook, right? These are more guidelines than they are solid rules. So you can build all the rules you want around an SLA, but ultimately you need to look at this from a standpoint of what if X goes away? What if, because again, people don't even think of it in terms of if you have a fire, you may not even be able to get into your building for a couple of days while they're going through the investigation and all of the other things that are involved. So what do you do when something major like that, a flood or anything else that can dramatically affect your business? What do you do in that interim? So this is, and again, I could do a whole bunch on BCDR, but we won't spend any more time on that. Let's look at the most important difficult goals. And this is interesting because ultimately these things really align in terms of what's most important and what's difficult. And you could read into this at your own convenience because we could go on and on about each of these, but ultimately resilience becomes most important, not resilience, but flexibility becomes most important. And ultimately, this is where IT is being forced to do more with less, so it seems to be a contradiction here. It's the most difficult to be responsive because of all the factors we looked at a couple slides back when we said these are the top IT pain points, which are not enough people or not enough new technology. But they still are the most important points. So if you look at the top two, responsive and enabling, and then third, improving reliability and availability, these are all very consistent across any polling that we do. And it's interesting that they remain similar, that they're both most important and most difficult. Do you have anything you want to add to this, Vinny?
No, I mean, it's very consistent with with conversations I have with my customers for sure. And this is a great representation of looking at I'll call it the gap, if you will, between what the business wants to achieve versus what IT is sometimes capable of achieving based on the tools and capabilities that they have at their disposal. Folks like us are in the business of helping customers kind of shorten up that gap, right? Because there's a broad variety of choices of technologies, methodologies, architectures that can certainly help assist with that, but very consistent with what I'm seeing out there.
And most interesting too is if you'll notice where cost resides on this, it's at the bottom of the chart, right? And again, maintaining cost is a bigger challenge, but it becomes most important as well. So ultimately, where reducing the cost of the previous chart said, wow, this is at the top, we want to keep our costs down. Ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, there's a lot of other things that are more important than purely looking at cost. Technology with the greatest transformational impact is interesting too, because we're surrounded by this stuff, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on too. But these are the things that technologists, of 1,100 technologists, these are the things that they believed would have the greatest transformational impact. And cloud is number one. And this is where, again, I point to the fact that the cloud is not just about someone else's computer, because that's what everybody's always just, you're doing the same with someone else's computer. No, the cloud is actually about the evolution of IT process, where rather than building out things ad hoc and tying everything to hardware, what we're using in the cloud and cloud native is actually utilizing high-level services that are dynamic, available, assignable, and controllable, rather than doing everything on an ad hoc basis where it is tied directly to a hardware platform underneath. So when I talk about the cloud, it's a delivery model. It's a new way of addressing and having access to these resources that are dynamic, that are scalable, that are easy to consume, and that don't require constant monitoring. This requires a lot. This is the next generation of what IT is. And I hate that it's called cloud because, again, cloud has built a bad reputation for itself. But really, the cloud is all about the evolution of the data center to a much more dynamic and flexible environment.
Yeah, I totally agree, Stephen. And I totally agree with that. And it's funny, like I'll pick I'll pick number 2 in this list, in artificial intelligence, right? So this is where we can start hitting on my pet peeves around vocabulary and overused terminology. So I'm at this conference, and of course that topic of conversation, deep learning, machine learning, or analytics. It's everyone is, there's unilateral agreement that is this next gen of of transformational technology on the horizon. What I find very interesting, is that the majority of manufacturers that that talk to this space get very myopic about the hardware and software, largely about the hardware that they have the potential to push into this world, and they get very centered around it. And of course I'm not really the skeptic, but just trying to represent customers, and I raise my hand and say, well, okay, I understand what you're a server manufacturer. I understand why you're going that way, but you haven't solved the non-trivial data integration, data engineering, software stack, consultancy that happens 4 steps before you ever get to that platform. I'm not discounting, or discrediting the 50 engineers that went down into the basement to design this engineered, AI platform, that you're looking to push into the market. All I'm saying is that as a consumer or someone representing a variety of consumers, we need help in overcoming these data integration and data engineering challenges before we ever get to the platform. So in as much as I think there's unilateral agreement on the priorities of these transformational technologies, I think it's very healthy to grab hold of a consultancy and walk hand in hand through the application and use cases of these technologies, and making sure that they apply directly to your business. Right?
That's exactly right. And ultimately, so many of these things are open-ended questions. And we'll bag on this, some of these technologies a little later on, but ultimately it comes down to if you don't know what your intent is, and Vinny brought it up. This is something that I always look at too. Is the intelligent process of doing is you start from the back. What is the result you want, and move forward. You see the business environment and the business needs. You look for a software environment that resolves those business needs or can help the best, and then you put it on the appropriate platform, not the other way around. But we'll get back to that in a little bit here. Let's look at the third point, which is adopting a fluid infrastructure, which goes hand in glove with the whole cloud discussion. I believe, Vinny, why don't you take the first one, right? Or is this you?
Yeah, so and Steve, you hit on it before, right? Now, cloud certainly has many, and offers many advantageous, aspects, to it. It is a consumption model, right? That has really caused the industry to look at how, customers will purchase and consume, compute technologies, infrastructure technologies, research technologies moving ahead. You and I talked briefly, before the broadcast around, things like hyperconverged, and we're starting to see in my conversations with folks that provide hyperconverged platforms, this notion of, hey, we not only want to sell these products in the traditional fashion of, hey, you're going to buy 4 nodes and stand it up in your private data center, but we also want to augment that with a cloud-like consumption model, buy based on utilization in a colo, and stitch those two things together. I was like, wow, that's really interesting, right? So in that model, you're afforded, even in a hyperconverged architecture, hybrid cloud-like capability, hybrid cloud-like consumption model, but in a management framework that just makes it so much easier to manage your workload. So
exactly, and ultimately it looks at compute, storage, and network as dynamic resources. And again, this is where cloud native becomes an incredibly interesting model, where instead of having, you could just choose from a menu of really useful, and if you look at any cloud menu, or I should say any cloud service catalog, ultimately the ability to be able to do these things on demand is a huge advancement over the way that they were doing things in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the hybrid cloud architecture, everyone is moving towards it. Some folks are even gravitating towards multi-cloud architectures. It really affords the greatest flexibility if it's architected and engineered the right way. So, I think one of the things that we're kind of trying to unwind now is those folks that kind of ran, whole hog into cloud first without a consultancy walking alongside them. And what they've discovered now is this, like, ooh, I didn't realize it would cost that much, and now I got to back out, what I put there. We are espousing, certainly in today's world, better planning and better, to make sure that you garner the efficiencies that come with hybrid cloud or public cloud architecture as it stitches back into your private, so you can get that biggest bang for your buck, right? So a very, very key consideration.
And I try to look at public cloud as an option rather than a final destination. Excuse me. And it goes to the fact that people think, well, I do a cloud first. Well, what does that actually mean? I mean, realistically, I still look at cloud as something a little bit different. You don't go out and buy the cloud. It provides a platform for simplified data movement, workload movement, and the dynamic resources that you can use. So you're no longer limited by your internal infrastructure. But it should be just another tool in your tool belt as opposed to being, this is where we want to go. I mean, again, there's a lot of things that go into that calculation. And to simply say, oh, for cost, we're not going to put any infrastructure in, no, that's not necessarily the right angle for every business. Now, there are some cloud-based businesses that it makes sense, but ultimately, you need to think in terms of what's best for the business and what's best for the workflow.
Yeah, and the last point on, the last bullet on this slide really talks to we'll call it the figuring out the ideal location for your workload and for your data, right? So Workload is a little bit easier to wrap your brain around because we're living in a world where folks are very accustomed to dynamically moving workload based on certain triggers or certain performance requirements. But the data component of it is becoming much more important in terms of planning, right? Because of things like data sovereignty, because of things like GDPR, data privacy, protection, things of that nature. We're down here, at the conference I'm in. There's been a couple of conversations around that kind of went along the lines of this. Is that customer had 6 petabytes of data that and they had a cloud-first strategy, so it all went to the cloud. And come to find out that because of data sovereignty or GDPR requirements, that they have to pull it back. Face of the problem of moving 6 petabytes out of a public cloud back into on-prem is one that I don't envy them having. So it's,
no, that's exactly right. And again, this is where data generates gravity or generates mass because it just continues to grow. And it's not like you could just move it in a wing from one place to another. You could spin up workloads easily, dynamically, that can last minutes and then shut down just as quickly, but the data that supports it or the data that's created by it, completely different critter. Let's look at the next point. And again, this is not the argument that on-premises is the only way to go either. It doesn't make any sense either, because realistically, on-premise infrastructures still have challenges, especially in terms of speed and performance. Because even if you're doing virtualization, even if you're doing things in a private cloud model, you need to have the ability to be able to scale. And this goes back to scalability as being a major factor. So if you look at speed and performance, scalability, cost, these are challenges that are still relatively common in the on-prem infrastructure. But if you look at what companies are thinking about doing, and this is a question of where you think you're heading in terms of this, most of them are looking at a hybrid environment. And again, because it leverages the ability of having what you need to have on-prem, whether it's from a performance perspective or security or availability or whatever, because you can't forget the line in between the cloud and your on-prem environment. It's maybe just simply as basic as a bandwidth issue. Ultimately, most companies are saying, look, we love the idea of the automation within the cloud, of the abstraction and high-level services, but we can't put it all in the cloud. I look at hybrid as being an idea that the hybrid cloud or public cloud, is an extension of your infrastructure. It should be dynamically available to you, and it shouldn't matter where those workloads reside, provided you're providing a common environment in terms of policy and management.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's funny. If you look at that previous slide with with the challenges, if you took something like performance, right, top of the list, and you were built on a hybrid cloud environment, knowing what I know about how I call them the ingredients manufacturers, the folks that make that make silicon that power the compute architectures that we have out there. Every time they make a generational change in a processor, you can leverage hybrid cloud. They will go to the megascalers and get their products out in those environments, early and fast. So if you're built on hybrid, you can even, you're of the mindset of wanting to push that performance envelope, you can use hybrid as a or the public portion of your hybrid environment as a staging area. So hey, great, Cascade Lake from Intel just came out. Those are available on a particular megascaler or hyperscaler provider. Let me move my workload out there, make sure and vet it out, make sure that all flies, and then you can slowly modernize your on-prem infrastructure with confidence that you've already tweaked that workload to work well within that new hardware platform.
Exactly, and this actually leads into the next point, and this is something that we've been internally at 451 have been debating, because ultimately the whole idea of repatriation it had negative connotations, right? I mean, ultimately a hybrid cloud environment should be a two-way street. And this is a belief, because ultimately I look at, again, the cloud as an extension of your infrastructure rather than as a destination. And, if you look at the companies there's a lot of companies that have moved things out to the cloud, found out that it didn't work out well, and had to move them back. That's a natural part of any kind of dynamic environment, really. It doesn't mean that they won't work in a year or a month, but again, this is an evolutionary process where we're still understanding all the ramifications of having these kinds of dynamic environments available to us. So ultimately, there's no shame in putting something in the cloud, understanding that, hey, it didn't really work out because of scale or performance or whatever, and bringing it on back to on-prem. And then, exploring as you go along. And this is, again, I think it points to the error that's made in going all in on a technology without understanding the underlying considerations. IT is a complex environment. So, go ahead. I mean, you think?
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I what comes to mind are use cases like IoT. So, in the next year, you'll see, more architectures, more deployments of those technologies, especially as 5G emerges. What's interesting is that there was a statistic thrown around the conference here, something to the effect that, in the years to come, and they throw around the data growth number, which is now it's like in the order of like 130 zettabytes, 130 million zettabytes, or something like on that magnitude by 2025. Big number, right? And they're saying that the majority of that data is going to come from edge devices. So if you think about the transitionary nature of the data that we're talking about here, it'll come from edge devices. There will be some edge computing done there, but that's going to get hauled back into a data center, presumably in the cloud. And there you'll do some initial analytics, and then the insight that comes from that will be pulled out of that back into your prem. So the transitory nature of data in the years to come is ideally suited to hybrid environments. I mean, it is great to keep in mind that having that two-way street in and out of your center of compute will be a key characteristic in those architectures in years to come.
Absolutely. And let's look at the last one, is future-proofing your data management. And this is an interesting point. I believe, Vinny, you lead this off, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is funny. So, data. You hear these terms, right? Data is the new oil, right? Data is the new asset. There's and I love when folks kind of coin that phraseology. When I say data is the new oil, because my next question after that is, great, what does your data refinery look like? Because really what you want is this infrastructure that lets you process your data, if it's the oil, in a number of different ways to produce different petroleum products, right? Data petroleum products. It is old is new, I guess is really what that first bullet espouses. That data that companies have been keeping around for a long time still has a ton of value. I have a friend who's in life sciences. They keep everything forever, basically, right? It's like tens of petabytes of data, and they have this interesting problem of, well, how do we manage that moving forward? But at the same time, going back through that data, to get historical insight, especially in their space, is hugely important. So, it's what's old is new, and what's old is still pretty darn valuable towards the valuation of your company. Yeah.
And the bigger challenge now is that because we're seeing data in different locations, you need some kind of policy-based management environment that can span multiple locations. And this is something that is evolving now, whether it's through metadata and object storage, or whether it's just through a different model by which you store or build a data lake. Ultimately, you need to have policy-based management that addresses the legal and compliance issues for your business and extends to wherever that data is going to reside.
Yeah. Yeah, so the third bullet there, compliance and security, right? It's one of my favorite topics. Steve and I talk about building the foundation, the right foundation that incorporates the capabilities like encryption, like mechanisms to ensure data privacy and data security. That compliance piece we talked around GDPR earlier. I get in front of folks and I ask that question of, hey, what's your GDPR position? Half the time I get the response of, well, that's an EU problem. That's not a U.S. based problem. Until you start asking questions like, well, you're marketing to folks in the in the EU, aren't you? Like, well, yes. Well, and you're collecting PII against those folks, right, for marketing purposes. Well, now GDPR just became your problem. So that's the first big piece of it. I was watching this documentary on TV the other day, and the statement of the United States is the worst. It has the worst digital privacy policy, or actually, it was more along the lines of, we have no data privacy policy in this country. I will tell you that as a consultant and as a strategist in this business, that is coming real fast, real soon. So discussions around state of California, and there's other municipalities that are already dictating their requirements and regulations on digital privacy will land squarely in this country in a very short time frame. So what it says is part of your data platform and your digital platform, it has to incorporate these elements. So it's a good time to reinspect.
Right, and these laws are going to make your data both an asset and a liability. And this has always been the case. So if you talk to a company that gets sued all the time, they realize that you wake up one morning and your data has become evidence, changes everything forever. So this is going to happen more and more often. If you look at all the growth in e-discovery, that's going to also carry over into these all new privacy laws. And it's not only about protecting and securing, it's also about the ability to be forgotten, which is a major challenge when it comes to the concepts of, can you ensure that you're responding to a right to be forgotten across all of your data? What about your backups? What about sources that you may not have considered, whether it's unstructured data that's poorly identified or whether it's rogue data that somebody took home? Ultimately, you're responsible for all that, regardless of where it is.
Yeah, and I think the final cornerstone to future-proofing your data management strategy is really lifecycle management, your data lifecycle management, right? So we're talking the orders of magnitude increase in data sets is causing us to go back. It's kind of old school playbook, right? It's like going back and rethinking, well, care and feeding and protection of our data. It's like it's a different animal, or will be a different animal in the years ahead. How do you quote unquote back up tens of petabytes? How do you back up quote unquote a zettabyte or more? It's Steve and I have these pithy conversations around, hey, tape is back, because the long term archive, it never went away. It just became uncool for a little while. Now it's going to be cool again. But as mundane as it sounds, those technologies may reemerge as a viable alternative for long-term archive. But what it speaks to is that there's this strategy and planning piece that goes hand in hand, with the longer-term care and feeding of your infrastructure and your data as part of your overall strategy.
And this goes back to the question here, and this slide is your infrastructure future-proof? We asked companies whether they believed that it was or not, and for the most part, people said that they were the right-sized. We'll agree with this tongue-in-cheek, because realistically, some of this grows organically, but the big question, and this is the one where if you look at this quote from a financial services company, they suddenly started questioning their ability to deliver agility. And that's what future-proofing is really all about, is about whether it's performance, whether it's about the appropriate use and protection of data. Ultimately, future-proof is a very broad term, and a lot of companies don't believe that they're at that point yet. Moving on to the next slide, even though that we're seeing all this change, it doesn't really change the dynamics, or it hasn't up to this point. Most companies are still using an IT department with a dedicated IT staff, as opposed to farming it out or outsourcing it. This, I don't know if this is true what you're seeing as well, Vinny, but there's still a lot of legs left in the dedicated IT
Yeah.
model.
Yeah, I say very much so. I will say though that I think the span of control has changed somewhat, and I encourage like all of my customers to make sure that in this world of hey, I can swipe a credit card and stand up a workload in the cloud, or I want to do this, I want to do DevOps for the purposes of faster time to market and development efficiency, to make sure that traditional IT is part of the conversation, because somewhere along the way, they become the inheritors and the owners of the cool, wizzy technologies that those non-IT departments ingest into their business units, because the long-term care and feeding really is in the wheelhouse of core IT. So make sure that they know it's coming, because they can actually offer potential alternatives and ways to manage.
And there's still, and this next slide carries over and basically says that most companies still have a traditional IT infrastructure, but that's evolving. And it's because, again, this is a matter of utilizing the right technology for the right problems. So you're going to see more and more of this movement, and it's really pretty specifically dependent on things, SaaS, for example, in terms of email or in terms of office suites, private cloud infrastructure, and again, the whole idea of on-premises being just an extension of off-premise or vice versa. Ultimately, the question is how much cloud do we need? Well, just enough to be able to access what we want to move on. Going to the next slide here, the workload automation is still a problem. Even though we've been doing a lot of virtualization, a lot of cloudification, most processes are still relatively manual, but this is changing dramatically. In 2 years, we're seeing a substantial difference in terms of automation with policy-based automation, orchestration, and automation with manual exception handling. Because, again, the humans, no matter how intelligent they say AI is, humans are still really the core of being able to bring insight to a problem that computers simply can't.
Yeah, and this is so totally. I'm down here and I'm asking, and these are the areas that I'm asking lots of questions about. Like this to me is the next large bastion of opportunity out there, right? It's folks that are well versed in orchestration technologies, right? To provide better efficiencies. Absolutely.
And this goes, and we could literally riff on this for about a half an hour alone, because these are industry buzzwords. This happens all the time. We just asked them what they thought was the most overhyped. Blockchain kind of makes sense purely because nobody really understands what the ramifications are. It's interesting, but ultimately you have to step back and say, well, what business problem does it solve? And how efficiently does it solve it versus other things? The same thing with AI or ML or analytics or the Internet of Things. These are terms that companies are hammering us with all the time. But again, it's all blue sky. It's all about, well, this is where the potential is. But realistically, there still has to be the process of looking at your IT environment and your business environment and seeing if these things have a useful potential. And I guess our parting thoughts is, again, keeping your eye on the ball. As technologists, it's our job to find and recommend and be able to look across a broad variety of technologies to meet the needs of your business. Business first. Have a plan. And again, as we said earlier, and again, this is something Vinny and I talked about at the very beginning, is that how can you get where you want to go if you don't know where that is? And really, IT is about solving those business problems, and that can be easier if you have a cohesive path to follow that's well-defined and flexible. And the last point is building consensus, and this goes back to the human factor. Working ultimately with customers, with business leaders. Change is the way of life for IT, but it's difficult for end users, and it can be difficult for IT because we too can get set in our ways, or we can get too involved in the fascinating complexities to lose. It's relatively simple to lose track, or to forget about the really specific business needs that you're trying to solve. And that's where user involvement and buy-in improves odds of success, whether it's a political issue or whether it's simply understanding, and this is the challenge as a technologist, understanding what the business person wants to do and then applying technology to the appropriate places. So anything you want to add to that in closing?
Yeah, yeah, sure. That last one, that build consensus one, it always, to me, it always ties back to culture, and culture is owned, is owned by the most senior leadership within an organization. It starts at the top and works its way down. So change is not easy, but the change agent or the chief change agent officer is that person at the top. So it starts there and goes pervasively down the rest of the organization. And folks have to learn to embrace the transformational changes that may affect their day-to-day. It's something that's not easy. Yeah.
And we've tried to boil the ocean in one conversation here, so apologies. We've run a bit long, but we're open to answering any questions from the audience. And may I point out, and Colleen, you could take it away if we have anything, but I'll point out that if we don't have a chance to get to your question, we'd be happy to answer it after the fact with an email. So, Colleen?
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. All right. So as a reminder, if you do have those questions, type them in the box below, and we will get to as many as we can. So the first question we have for today is, do we have to build a private cloud on premises for this approach to work?
It's a good question. And how much cloud is the right amount of cloud, right? I've always looked at it from a standpoint of saying you just need enough cloud to be able to provide yourself the flexibility of using public cloud. But how do you look at it, Vinny?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is no. You don't have to. That's part of the flexibility promise of cloud. Most of the customers that I talk to, have two environments stood up in on-prem and one in cloud. The next endeavor for them is, how do I stitch that together? So they go back and look at their cloud implementation. And interestingly enough, now that this has been going on for 3 years or so now, I get a lot of, hey, can you come in and have a look at what I have built that's been running for 3 years? I have 2 production apps out there. Am I ready to go big? So there, it's an interesting place and time for that.
And not everything translates well to the cloud. But again, the whole idea of making your hybrid cloud strategy a flexible environment means that you really kind of need to look to provide similar services on-prem so that you can easily extend to the cloud. And this is not always about cloud bursting, which is different than workload portability. But ultimately, the whole idea of the cloud should be dynamic availability of resources, and making that shift between on-prem and off-prem means that you need to kind of organize your environment in such a way that it's easy to do that. So you only need just enough cloud. And the beauty of a cloud environment is it's designed to be easily scalable. So whether it's based on traditional infrastructure or whether it's based on HCI, ultimately it comes down to making Dynamics resources available to your development team, available to your business owners, and making it dynamic so that they don't have to deal with the underlying infrastructure and reducing the complexity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would also add to that the folks that gravitated towards a cloud first philosophy and implemented cloud first by basically going with lift and shift. I think those folks are finding now that, hey, that probably wasn't the best way to do that. So
right.
So judicious planning.
If you look at the cloud model, you look at, geez, I don't have to buy any more infrastructure. Well, yeah.
Well,
it depends,
it's the easiest way to do it, right? Because it's the easiest way to go because there's not a lot of rework, and in some cases you get to reuse the same tools. That's not always the best approach. So that's why we just say this judicious planning.
Yeah.
Is key.
Any other ones, Colleen?
Yeah, that's all we have time for today. But as you had mentioned, if any other questions come through, we will be happy to answer those via email. So thank you so much, both Steve and Vinny. That concludes today's webcast. As a reminder, the on-demand replay will be available on Bright Talk soon. On behalf of EchoStor and 451 Research, thank you so much for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.